think everyone here will know why I was pleased that these three people agreed to the invitation. I'm going to try and draw some of the threads of the talks together by asking some questions which I hope all of you will respond to bits of, and to have what Rudd is said not to have, a conversation between the four of us. I have to say I have to admit shamefacedly that I was an enthusiast for all sorts of reasons in the first couple of years of the Rudd government, for reasons not unconnected to my relationship to Mr. Howard. And I think I've made a really terrible misjudgment of Kevin Rudd, I have to say. But there are bits about him which I genuinely don't understand, in his government and his prime ministership and his character. Maybe, Judy, this one I can ask of you, because you've written in the area of political psychology. We'll see what happens. I first really noticed Rudd even when he wrote a piece for the monthly magazine called Faith in Politics. And there it was a time when, because actually of the Australian newspaper to some extent, it was very hard to discuss certain issues without being ridiculed, to do with asylum seekers, stolen generations or whatever. And he wrote in a high moral language. Anyhow, the bit that I now think is very strange is that he said his great hero was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stands for the greatest kind of act of moral and political courage in the 20th century for Rudd. And then, in the last few months, I have, it's been said by almost everyone, I've never seen such cowardice over the ETS. It's both cowardly and also misjudged. But the cowardice is what I want to concentrate on. How can one put together a person whose moral hero is Dietrich Bonhoeffer and whose actions make Graham Richardson seem to be principled? And who has acted on the greatest moral challenge of the 20th century or humankind in such a cowardly way? I can't put it together.
Well, I mean, I don't actually have much of a psychological take on Rudd because I find him so incredibly unappealing. So I find it was very unempathic. And I thought what Lenore was saying was very interesting about this moment at which things snapped, because I can't bear to listen to him anymore, except I have a professional commitment to hearing what he says. And so I think that he's now, it's at the point where people leave the room, you turn him off, so whatever. But it seems to me that sort of gap between high moral stands and practical implementation is not, it's very common. It's the theorist saying what people should do, and that Rudd's failings are all in terms of an incredible sort of lack of understanding of what politics is about and his inexperience. It's the difficulties of actually delivering on morally challenging questions in terms of, what Weber says about politics as hard boring through hard boards. It's like he didn't understand that was part of the political process. So I don't see it so much as a sort of a psychological issue with him, although there obviously are ones, but as if he didn't understand what the nature of political power was.
Paul, do you?
I'd say a few things about it. I think this new generation is quite important. I think Rudd is an important psychological break from, if you like, the old-style politicians of Howard on the Conservative side and Keating on the Labor side. I think Keating and Howard are much more genuinely conviction politicians than Rudd. And I think the record here is quite clear, whether you agree or disagree with what they did. And I think, in a sense, Rudd is a product of a new, more modern style of politics with a much greater emphasis on short-term tactics and media management. I think that's important. And I think in that sense, there's a bit of a disconnect. In my presentation, I referred to a disconnect in Rudd between his, if you like, aspirations on the one hand and delivery on the other. It's almost as though, he's obsessed about announcements, vision, lists, deadlines, timetables, but not so good at all on the delivery. But of course this fits into the wider theory, because the announcements and the timetable and the ambitions all relate to media management and the announcement effect.
Yeah, can I take that up? And someone mentioned David Marr's quarterly essay and something in it. I mean, one of the things that struck me as, even at the time, as sort of fanciful, as what Paul's saying, Rudd announced that he was going to redesign the Asia Pacific, which is a relatively major enterprise. And I thought at the time it's strange. All he's done is he appointed a retired diplomat, Richard Woolcott, to do it, which again struck me as a bit unlikely that Richard would be able to do that. But it turns out in David Marr's quarterly essay that Richard Woolcott is complaining that he hardly gets to see Rudd. So the man that's going to reshape the Asia Pacific can't even get an interview. And so I suppose what I'm asking is how is this grandiosity? I mean, is it just because at the time it's like Walter Mitty, or there's some sort of absolute fantasy life that seems to be going on?
I think this is actually a really good example, because what happened, I was there the night Rudd made this announcement at this big dinner in Sydney, and Dick Woolcott was in the audience at the next table, and this has all been published. In fact, it was published the next morning. Rudd called Woolcott at about 5:30 that afternoon and had a very short phone conversation with him, asking him whether he would do this diplomatic job of recasting and redesigning the Asia Pacific. And they had a very short conversation, and that was it. And this tells you so much about the sort of snap decisions, the lack of proper preparation. No other country was sounded out about it. Most ministers knew nothing about it, and the chosen envoy was only contacted 2 hours before the announcement.
And similar thing, Rudd was going to bring about the end of nuclear armaments, and for that he appointed Gareth Evans. And I mean, recently Barack Obama had a major international conference on the question of nuclear disarmament, and because of some local problem, which probably all of us have forgotten, there was something going on in Australian domestic politics. Health, sorry, it's important. But Rudd didn't turn up. I mean, to the thing that he had said at a certain point he was going to commit his moral energy towards.
I just want to make one point on the climate change issue, which runs slightly counter to the debate, but I do think it's worth saying that while I've made it very clear that I think the ultimate decision was utterly unwise for both policy and political reasons, I think it is a bit unfair if we're to try to suggest that Rudd wasn't committed to the policy on the way through. I mean, I think the evidence shows that he did put an enormous amount of work into trying to craft some sort of policy that could get through the Senate, that could be implemented. And I know from watching the lead up to Copenhagen and from watching him at Copenhagen that he invested an enormous amount of time and effort into trying to get some sort of workable outcome from that. And I just think it's important to say that while he then abandoned it for reasons that I struggle to understand, but which I think are probably more to do with him not being able to see a way through. So he feared that if he stayed committed to the CPRS, some other things could happen internationally, to the bill in the US Senate, to other, in international fora, which would further undercut him. And he'd already been so undercut by both the domestic and the international outcomes. Also because when people started to then look into the continued commitment to the CPRS in the longer term, if there's no international consensus and the CPRS is entirely reliant on international permit purchase, you start to run into all sorts of trouble. So I think the ultimate decision to abandon him was largely political, but also in his mind, because he has this kind of incredibly methodical way of working through things, he could see so many other places where he was going to run into problems if he stuck to it, that he decided to abandon, and then did it in this way that, I think everyone's agreed is quite,
Can I ask you about that? It seemed to me, everyone said this, and this is an open question to the three of you. as soon as it was said that the person who described this as the greatest moral challenge, and I believe he believes that to be true, I don't think he's making that up. As soon as he decided to abandon it, everyone is kind of shocked. I mean, I was shocked and, astonished, and I think that was like the political class. That was generally true, no matter what position you took on the issue. I just don't understand this. Why could he or his advisors not see that this would shock people, shock the political class, shock everyone who cared about the issue, but also everyone who thinks there has to be a connection between, one's beliefs and what one does?
I think that, from what I can tell, there was an enormously ferocious debate within the government. I think they misjudged the extent to which people were shocked, but they knew that there would be an astonishment at the decision. But in their minds, all the other alternative courses of action were more fraught. That's the assessment that they made. I don't agree with it, but that was their assessment.
I think this goes again to the character of the government and this point about political tactics. This is a classic example of the state government mentality. This policy is now a bit of a problem for us. It was a plus earlier on, now it's a problem. How do we respond? Get it off the agenda. There's this sort of elemental simplicity. I think, in essence, that's what it was. And that really diminished the government because it diminished the true significance of this policy. And I think this is the obvious point which is overlooked in this sort of state government style approach to political tactics. And another very good example, I think, is the resources tax. The idea again was that we isolate this to one industry, that's a new tax, we can sell the tax, it's just a tax on one industry. Again, this is a classic example of this sort of mentality, without recognising that it's going to go to the heart of the government's economic standing.
But Paul, why don't they understand the difference between state and federal politics? I mean, that's right, because federal politics and the federal is subjected to a degree of scrutiny that state governments don't have. And people pay attention. I mean, state governments, you notice things and you don't, but there's nothing like the degree of scrutiny. And so I don't understand how they could make this sort of category mistake. Well,
I don't think it's just so much, I'm using the example of state politics to try and describe what I see as a change in Labor's political culture.
Okay.
And I think that's what we have seen. I think that it's a more cautious approach to government. They are risk adverse. They don't have a lot of confidence in their capacity to persuade people. It's tied into, as I said, the sort of 24-hour media cycle and the demands of modern politics. And the question it really raises is, well, what does Labor stand for these days, and to what extent is it really prepared to make a substantial commitment to prevail?
Sorry.
I was going to say, is it that they're risk adverse, or is it that when they take risks, they don't manage them all that well? In that, the CPRS was a risk. It was a risk to try and re-engineer the Australian economy in that way, and it was mismanaged. And the RSPT is a risk, an enormous risk in an election year, but a risk they considered that they believed that they could manage, and which, I think we've all said we think they're not managing well. So it's, I don't see that they're completely risk adverse. They just don't manage the risks that they can take all that well.
I think they misjudge them.
One of the ways of, I was going to ask the same thing as Lenore's just raised, and I'll put it in a different way. Those who know about horse riding, my wife does, when you fall off a horse, you get on quickly to show that you're really not afraid. So I took from the decision on the ETS that it was a government of massive risk aversion. And then suddenly, 2 or 3 weeks later, incredible risk to take on, it was Judy, wasn't it, who pointed out how powerful the mineral lobby was in the 80s over national land rights. To take on a lobby like that, to not prepare them, to do it a few months before an election, it's just, it's like risk madness.
But I think they misjudged that.
That becomes the issue then, doesn't it?
They went into that thinking that they would be able to manage the politics of this, and it may well be a net gain for them.
But how could they make that misjudgment? That's what I don't understand.
We seem to have hit a sort of conceptual brick wall. Well, that actually leads to something. I mean, very few statements of this year will stick, but I have a feeling Nick Xenophon's statement that they couldn't sell heaters to Eskimos will be one that we might remember. Again, for ordinary citizens, I don't think they had a chance of really understanding the ins and outs of the ETS and now the mining tax. I mean, there's no doubt that these are very difficult matters to explain, and before selling something, you've got to explain it. Again, what's gone wrong with the communication capacity?
With the ETS, there was never any attempt made to explain it. The government's political strategy was to get it through with the support of the coalition, but they never actually went out and explained the impact on households, the fact that it would have a real but relatively small economic impact on all Australians. The point of re-engineering and all those sort of concepts around it were never really communicated because they had put all their eggs in the basket of just getting it through with bipartisan support. I think with the mining tax, they figured that ambushing the mining industry would mean that people would sort of viscerally side with, our government against big bad bosses. And when that didn't work straight up, they then kind of backpedaled to actually try to explain the merits of the tax on its own. And I mean, I think that not exactly this design, but a profits-based mining tax does have merits. I think there's this validity to the idea. They've just made such a complete hash of it.
So is this underestimating the intelligence of the electorate by thinking that electorates don't want to be spun to but explained to?
I think so. That's my view.
Well, you've got to look at the way they approach reform. I think that you've got to prepare the ground for reform. These are big reforms. If you're talking about the carbon pollution reduction scheme, you're talking about a new resources tax, you really need to prepare the electorate for it over a period of time. And I think they haven't done that properly.
Which meant that we were having the debate about what effective rate of tax the mining industry does actually pay, whether it's sufficient or insufficient, whether a profits-based tax is the right way of dealing with it, and the specifics of the design of this profit, all at the same time, all conflated into 1 week. I mean, nobody's going to be able to communicate that.
I mean, what flows from this, and you were saying things earlier when we were just sitting out in the adjacent room, about the quality of two things: the kitchen cabinet, which is clearly very important, but also the quality of the private office, which is run by a number of young persons. Can I get you to talk a bit about the people surrounding Rudd in his daily work? And
I think it's tricky. I think the front bench, the cabinet, is pretty talented. If you look at individual ministers, they tend, with a couple of exceptions, but they tend to be competent, diligent, hard-working, capable, on top of their portfolios, and able to manage their policy issues pretty effectively in public. And what I say about the Rudd government is that the total you see is less than the sum of the parts. When you put it all together, something's gone wrong. What's gone wrong? Well, I think the answer to this is, what's gone wrong is the centralised coordination from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. And the government is not performing as well as it ought to be performing because the central system is dysfunctional. This goes to the heart of the way the Prime Minister conducts himself as Prime Minister and the way he runs his government and the quality of his office. And I guess it's unfair, but I mean, in my lifetime, the outstanding Prime Minister was unquestionably Bob Hawke. And he got a very good balance between delegating to his ministers and reserving to himself central dominant authority. He got that balance very effective, and he had a very high quality office. And I think Kevin Rudd suffers by those comparisons.
I would agree that he has insufficient political experience in his office. He has a lot of young advisors, many of them very bright young people, but he doesn't have senior people with political longevity and political memory to add to that. The reputation of the office within the government is dysfunctional, and they make all the decisions, but particularly decisions about when policies will be announced. And, ministers are often frustrated because they have an announcement, and for all sorts of reasons in their portfolio area, it needs to be announced. And it waits for sometimes months until, the grid in the PMO says it's time for it to go. And the Cabinet Minister, who is supposed to be responsible for the policy, seems to have very little say over that. I mean, I find it kind of shocking that the SPVC makes many decisions and ministers get to go in to put a case to SPVC, but they don't always even get to stay until the decision is made. They oftentimes get sent out again while the decision about their subject matter, which they're across, which they've worked up, is made by other people. And I think that's not a recipe for a well-functioning government. And as for Cabinet, well, they just kind of rubber stamp what SPVC has already done.
It's not working.
No.
Can I ask one more question, then I'll open it up to the floor. The question is this. I mean, I think it was Paul that said that he's not a conviction politician, unlike previous. On the other hand, there's another paradox which I don't understand. He almost began his prime ministership. He spent his summer writing a piece on what was wrong with neoliberalism. It was the most sort of ideological statement that I think any prime minister has ever made.
But wasn't that just in order to use the global financial crisis to do the opposition in the eye? I mean,
well, that's what I'm asking. I took it as if he meant it, and that I thought actually Andrew Charlton, who was a student of Joseph Stiglitz, had convinced Rudd that there was a case to be made about international architecture and the folly of the deregulatory philosophy and so on.
I've got no doubt that both Charlton and Rudd believed that and that was true, but the way that essay was written was in such sort of cartoonish terms, in such black and white, that I thought you could only really read it as a political document to, politicise the economic crisis that we were in at the time. Rather than a treatise about the policy positions that they clearly were prosecuting in international arena at the time.
And I would just add to that, I mean, I took Paul to mean when he's talking about a conviction politician, not just that somebody's sort of got beliefs, but that they've got the commitment and courage to follow those through in a reasonably dogged way, and they're prepared to wear the costs of them. Because
so you have convictions, but you also have to.
Well, conviction is not just about what's in your head. I mean, it's also about what you enact. And one of the things that seems to me to be a characteristic is that when Paul was talking about all these different contradictions, all these different things that Rudd believes, it's like it's not prepared to see that some policies is going to be winners and losers. And as soon as a loser pops up their head, he says, "Don't worry, nothing's going to happen. You'll be all right." And it's. So that the not selling of the ETS, it seemed to me, was partly because they didn't actually want to point out that there was going to be some real costs being borne by certain sections of the community. So it seemed to me there was a sort of almost deliberate deceptiveness there, because once costs appear, Rudd doesn't seem to be able to stare them down in comparison with, and I think it might have even been Paul that I read on the weekend. I mean, when the tariffs were being reduced, there's victims all over the place in the manufacturing sector, and the Keating-Hawke government had the conviction to wear that for long-term goals. And so I think that conviction is not just about believing something, it's actually got to be something that's enacted across a number of years.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Time for you.
What does the panel think about Rudd's record on real innovation in terms of sustainable technology?
Not good.
Well,
I think would be the answer.
Well, I think at the moment it's fraught with contradictions, because we have a whole bunch of policies designed to prove up renewable energy sources, for example, but we don't know if we'll ever have the cost on carbon which will make them competitive with coal, so we don't know if there's any point in doing it anyway. We have a renewable energy target which only makes sense as a bridging mechanism to an economy-wide cost on carbon, which we don't know if we'll ever have anyway. So at the moment it's kind of confusing.
I think the point I'd make just quickly on this, which is tangential to the question, but Rudd's kept the targets. The targets, exactly, the targets remain and they're bipartisan, and it's absolutely clear there is no policy instrument which will allow us to get anywhere near those targets.
From either side.
So at the moment we've got a total disconnect between the targets on the one hand and the policy instruments on the other. The point being that you can only get near the targets if you price carbon. And they've decided they want to defer the question of pricing carbon. This whole debate about the renewable energy target is very, very fraught. This is a very marginal proposition, likely to be riddled with all sorts of abuses and problems.
But I mean, I'm not sure if you'd agree, Paul, but I don't think either side of politics has policies that could get to the targets.
Agreed, totally.
So, you know, they're both going into an election campaign with targets they can't meet.
In the last couple of months, we have seen the Rudd government endorse the same basic logic that the Howard government took. Mandatory detention, offshore detention, and then the most recent decision to suspend the processing of applications from asylum seekers from Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. And I think that is the same kind of effectively inhuman policy that the Howard government so cynically used to win votes and win elections.
Can I ask you to stop there so we have time to respond to that one, just because there's a limited amount of time. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because we haven't discussed the asylum seeker thing, and it's going to be a very big issue in the coming election, I think.
I agree. I think that if the Rudd government had wanted to differentiate itself or had been a government of conviction, it needed to actually make a political case to the electorate as to why the arrival of whatever the number is, 2,600 and whatever since the last election, is not a pressing issue of national security. Yes, it's an issue we have to manage, and yes, it's an issue with a whole lot of policy consequences, but no, it is not an invasion, it's not a tsunami, it's not a national security threat, and someone has to say it, because in the community this is seen as a really big thing. It's showing up in everybody's polling. I was listening to Alan Jones the other day, and I mean, it doesn't seem related, but in the minds of Alan Jones's listeners it was related. They all were linking asylum with, in their minds, the imminent arrival in Australia of Sharia law, which they believed was a proposition that was afoot and about to happen. I mean, the degree of misinformation in the community is astonishing, and it won't be changed unless someone makes the counter case. And at the moment, nobody's making the counter case. And in that equation, Labor will lose, because they can never be as tough on asylum as the coalition can.
Yeah, I saw a Brian Dorr, John Clark thing a couple of weeks ago, and one was asked of the other. Rudd was, it was a quiz on the Rudd government. He said, "What's your policy towards asylum seekers?" He said, "Keep them out and let them in." He said, "Right." Paul, do you?
Well, we've got to ask ourselves why the counter case that Lenore's talking about is not embraced by government and argued. I mean, that is the key question. And the answer to that question is, it's not, because people have no confidence the Australian public would accept the proposition. Now, that is the reality here in terms of the politics. Everything depends in this issue in terms of the boats. Now, what Rudd tried to do, and I'm sympathetic with him here, he came in and attempted to strike a compromise after Howard. And he tried to say, I will safeguard the borders, but I will also have a much more humane policy. And he introduced a series of reforms which made it clear that there was substance to that. It's true he kept detention, so he wasn't, completely reversing Howard's position. He was actually trying to find a compromise and a middle ground. That's what he was genuinely trying to do. Now, to a certain extent, that effort to find a compromise has been destroyed because of the number of boats that are arriving. And I think the reality here is that every Australian Prime Minister, including Malcolm Fraser, has been a border protectionist. Whitlam was, Hawke was, Rudd is, Rudd's successor, whether it's Gillard or Tony Abbott, will be. And the reason they will be is because they are not prepared to say at the end of the day that as the Australian government we will accept the arrival of boats, rather than attempt to take action to dissuade the arrival of boats. That's the core reality here.
I'm very tempted to begin an argument. Not exactly disagreeing, but making a difference. One of the things that I would say is that I think the left is sort of culpable here as well, in that it has pretended that the attempt that Rudd made to find a more moderate policy has no connection to the recent arrival of boats. It seems to me clearly, as soon as the policy was changed, they were banking on the fact that the old Pacific solution would keep on deterring just through memory, but that clearly didn't work. And I think it's important not to treat the electorate as fools. The electorate understands that if you have a more humane policy, you will have to then expect that desperate people will come here by boat and not pretend that it's just push and pull factors and the rest of it. So I found the whole debate from many angles frustrating. But
I just wondered, in light we've talked about Kevin Rudd, Tony Abbott presents quite a stark contrast, one might argue, to Abbott in terms of personality maybe. How do you see that playing out over the next few months leading up to the election? And why is it that you feel that the Liberal Party doesn't have its act together? I was under the impression that generally most oppositions in the lead up to an election, they don't look like they've got their act together, and everyone's always saying that the government looks good and they don't look bad. Thanks.
Well, that was my comment. Sorry. I think that the coalition hasn't done the work that an opposition needs to do in opposition to regroup after defeat, to work out what exactly it stands for, what its policy program is, to repair the sort of, or figure out the differences of opinion within their own grouping. And I mean, those differences of opinion were pretty evident last December and November and December, and it wasn't only on climate change. I mean, that was the issue that came to the fore, but the differences with Malcolm Turnbull ran much deeper than that. Now, they haven't been resolved. They're still sitting there, but they've been papered over because the government's been doing so extraordinarily badly, and Abbott is a very effective leader of the opposition, and he's been taking the fight to the government, as he should, as is his job. But that doesn't mean that he's fixed his internal issues, and I think that is an enormous potential problem. I also don't think he has laid out any clear policy prescription of his own. He's announced a number of policies, but even on the policies that he's announced, they've changed in the space of months. The Green Core policy, the parental leave policy, and whether the tax to pay for it would be permanent or not permanent. I mean, you can go through all of them and they've all sort of slid around a bit. So I think they're in a difficult position with the resources of opposition, which are minimal, and a big attack task against the government, which they're performing well. But when it comes to an election campaign, the scrutiny will be on them as an alternative government, particularly when the polls are close. And I think there's an awful lot that the coalition needs to do to show that they've got that they've got both their internal house in order sufficiently and a sufficient policy program to be credible in that sense.
I think Abbott had a great insight. He understood the Rudd government was much weaker than it appeared. And when he turned the heat up on it, the government started to melt. Now that surprised everybody. That surprised a lot of people in the government, the opposition, the media, but that was a very deep insight. Abbott felt, he stepped up and he started to mug Rudd, and he got runs on the board. And Rudd was in total control. He was in total control of the political environment. He loved it. When Brendan Nelson and Malcolm Turnbull were opposition leader, he had them all worked out. He was playing them on a break. He was in total control. Labor was a master of the political domain, and Abbott came in and just shook everything up. And it disorientated the government, and it's taken them a long time to try and get a fix on Abbott. And the fix they've got on Abbott, I think, is the right one. Their argument is that Abbott is too unsettling for the Australian community in terms of being a reliable Prime Minister. And I think they'll focus a lot on that. And finally, we shouldn't forget how effective Rudd was as a campaigner against Howard in 2007. If Rudd's got a script, if it's the right script, during a non-governing campaign period, Rudd's capacity to come across as a plausible and credible Prime Minister against Abbott should not be underestimated.
Final question, and then we'll cease.
Both Paul Kelly and Lenore, spoke about the centralisation of decision-making within the Prime Minister's office. One, when imagining the Prime Minister's office, keeps getting the imagery of the ABC series, The Hollow Men. Perhaps you probably know the office better than us and could offer us some insight there. But my question is, do you think the essential shunting of many of the cabinet ministers in the cupboard and keeping them away from the public light has led to media speculation, ridiculous media speculation, albeit, about Julia Gillard as a potential leader of the Labor Party? And do you think that's a big mistake of the Rudd government?
Well, I don't think the cabinet ministers are being hidden from public light. I mean, they're out there selling the government's wares on the media, and I think some of them, particularly Gillard and Tanner, do it very effectively. One of the interesting features of the government is there is an accepted successor to Rudd, that's Gillard, which could make the second term particularly interesting.
I would agree with that. And I think one of the extraordinary things about the first term is how effectively Gillard has used her position to very calmly and methodically establish that pecking order without ever really engendering any serious leadership speculation or tension. I think it's an extraordinary feat.
Well, it's my sad pleasure to have to conclude. I have to say I thank Judy, Paul, Lenore very much for what I found an incredibly interesting conversation and presentation. Thank you very much.